Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
Homesick by Ron Ripley. Jimmy Sue knew how to hide. He had been picked on most of the time in elementary school because of his high-functioning autism, and there were some days in middle school when he didn't think it was worth getting on the bus. Jimmy always did, of course. His mother would have been too upset to learn he was being picked on, and his father would have gone down to the school and gotten into a fight. Jimmy didn't want either of those events to occur, so he went to school. Most days. Some days, though, he knew it would be too difficult. Some days, boys like Carlton Erskine made it too hard. Jimmy had known Carlton since kindergarten. Carlton had picked on him since kindergarten. Only once in second grade had Jimmy told his parents about how miserable Carlton made him, and he instantly regretted it. That moment in his history informed him as to how his parents would react if they were to learn Carlton was still picking on him. Jimmy didn't want that. All this passed through his mind as he lay in bed, the old-fashioned thermometer in his mouth placed under his tongue. His mother sat on the bed beside him, dutifully counting the seconds until she could remove the thermometer and see what his temperature was. Jimmy wasn't feeling well, and he hoped it was the beginning of a cold and not the threat Carlton had delivered on the bus the previous day. "Open up," Jimmy's mother said in Cantonese. He did so, and his mother removed the thermometer. She frowned, and Jimmy waited. The frown was unreadable, as were most of his mother's expressions. "You have a fever of 100, she informed him, and set the thermometer down on the bed table. "I am going to give you a fever reducer. Do you need me to stay with you today?" Jimmy knew a smile was required, although he was never certain as to why his mother enjoyed such emotions. Still, he smiled and shook his head. "No, thank you." She frowned again. "Are you sure?" Jimmy nodded. "I will leave food for you if you become hungry," she told him. After a moment's hesitation, she leaned forward and kissed him on the forehead. "Try and sleep. It will be best for you." "I will try." He forced himself to smile again as his mother left the room. Jimmy lay in bed and listened as she spoke with his father. There was no argument about whether Jimmy should stay home. His father deferred to his mother in all things when it came to raising and caring for him. He suspected it was due to his paternal grandmother, who raised Jimmy's father alone in Hong Kong. Closing his eyes, Jimmy yawned, opened them, and realized he had fallen asleep at some point. His clock, in the shape of Lloyd from the Lego Ninjago series, showed it was 11:52. He wasn't certain how he had managed to sleep several hours without noticing, but he suspected some of it was due to the fever he felt working through him. There was sweat on his brow, and his bedclothes were damp with it as well. He sat up and had to remain still for a moment, his head pulsing. Jimmy was thirsty, and without any further hesitation, he stood up and stumbled into the bathroom. He filled his cup and drank it quickly, then winced at the way the water seemed to churn in his stomach. He remained in the bathroom for a short time, uncertain whether he would throw up. When he felt it was safe to venture out, he did so by taking short steps and making certain he wouldn't be too far from the bathroom if he had to rush back. Reaching his room, Jimmy held onto the door jamb and waited. When he didn't faint or become weaker, he decided to try the stairs. His feet tread softly on the hall carpeting. Once he stood at the top of the stairs, he gazed down them and realized he couldn't navigate them safely in an upright position, so he sat down and slid down on his behind, doing so carefully, moving onto one stair at a time. At the landing for the first floor, he shakily got to his feet and refused to look back up the stairs. With one hand on the wall for support, he walked into the kitchen and stopped, closing his eyes and enjoying the warmth of the sun as it streamed in through the window over the sink. As he stood there, he heard a faint laugh, a sound that made him shudder. Jimmy opened his eyes warily and forced himself to walk to the sink. Leaning on it to keep himself upright, he gazed out over the backyard, and his shoulders sagged. Carlton Erskine had skipped school. The boy was in the woods behind Jimmy's house. It wasn't because Carlton knew Jimmy was home, but because Carlton's house was on the other side of it. They had been neighbors, of a sort, Jimmy's entire life, and he had always hated it. His mother never attempted to force him to have a friendship with Carlton, although that boy's mother tried on several occasions, finally sending Jimmy back home after Carlton had given him a bloody lip in the 2nd grade. "Why are you home?" Jimmy wondered, watching Carlton and another boy try to hit each other with sticks. "Why is Dave Schmidt with you?" "Oh," Jimmy thought, nodding. "The test in history today." Carlton and Dave were both poor students. Poor because they refused to work, not because they were mentally deficient. They were, as Jimmy had overheard several of the teachers say, neurotypical. So there was no reason other than pure laziness for their poor performance regarding schoolwork. "You both skipped school to avoid a test." Jimmy shook his head. "You'll just have to take it Monday." Jimmy sighed, upset with how slowly he was thinking. "Of course, they'll have the whole weekend to study. I bet that's what they told themselves, or at least their parents." Jimmy knew that both sets of parents were permissive. Carlton and Dave bragged about it before. Shaking his head, Jimmy looked around the countertop to see what his mother had left him for food. There was a teacup and a pot of tea beneath a cozy, and there were small biscuits beneath the plastic wrap on a plate. A note, written in his mother's beautiful Chinese, was beside the biscuits. "Eat slowly, drink your tea, and rest." He smiled and nodded. Within a few minutes, he was on the couch, eating slowly and drinking tea, following his mother's orders to the letter. He considered watching something, but there was nothing that came to mind. His thoughts were unusually hazy, and he hoped they would clear up soon. As he finished his tea, returning the cup to the saucer on the coffee table in front of him, Jimmy thought he heard a faint scream. He cocked his head to one side, listened, and waited. At first, he didn't hear anything. Then another scream, fainter than the first, caught his attention. Setting his half-eaten biscuit down, Jimmy got to his feet and walked to the back door. He pushed the curtain aside and peered out at the yard and the trees beyond it. Neither Carlton nor Dave were in the trees, but there was something. Squinting, he saw it was more than one thing. In fact, he counted 3 of them, and none of them were taller than he was, and they were all difficult to see. Each one seemed to blend in perfectly with the trees, and it was only by focusing on the area around the figures that he was able to see that they were dragging 2 bundles. 2 large bundles wrapped in burlap sacks and writhing. Another scream rang out, and one of the shapes kicked a bundle. It was that sharp, sudden movement that allowed Jimmy to get a good, hard look. Definition sprang forward, and he was able to see features and colors distinctly. The face was harsh, almost as though it had been carved out of wood and painted to look like bark. Its hair appeared to be moss and twigs, its mouth a slim gash across the lower half of its face. The eyes were dark and sunken in deep pits. There was no glint, no shine, and Jimmy wondered how they looked close up. Then, as a cloud drifted in front of the sun, the creature appeared to vanish, and the bundles were dragged along as though by invisible hands. Jimmy glanced in the direction the bundles were being taken. It was a deeper section of the woods, a part where there weren't even any logging roads. They would soon be on the edge of the Anger town line. Jimmy looked back at the bundles and knew, without a doubt, that both Carlton and Dave were in them. "Should I let them be taken away?" he wondered. Both boys were miserable to him, but Jimmy didn't think that should amount to a death sentence. and he was fairly certain that they were going to be killed. Anger was a strange town, and strange events took place within it. The vanishing of 2 middle schoolers would make news, even in such a place as Anger, but Jimmy was more concerned with the feelings of the boys' parents. He didn't like Carlton or Dave, but they didn't deserve to die because they were mean. The sanctity of human life was a belief his parents had instilled in him, and while he failed to understand how it could be applied to everyone, Jimmy, nonetheless, did his best to follow his parents' moral lessons. Jimmy went to the stairs and climbed up them warily. When he reached his parents' room, he went into their small, private bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. He found a fever reducer and another that promised to take away the aches and pains of being sick. Jimmy took the recommended dosage for each, and then he closed his eyes and tried to understand what it was he had seen. The creatures looked like monstrous dark beings, which, he suspected, would be more than happy to eat Carlton and Dave. Jimmy knew there were ghosts in Anger. He had seen the evidence of a vampire as well. It stood to reason, then, that there might be other mythological creatures. He opened his eyes. Wincing, he went down into the basement to his father's organized workroom. He stood there for several minutes, trying to remember where he had seen the nails he was thinking of. A small sense of satisfaction had filled him when he saw a glass jar filled with what he knew were referred to as coffin head nails. They were iron nails used in flooring, and his father had kept the surplus from when he repaired the hardwood floor in the dining room. Many creatures of myth could not abide the touch of iron. It was a simple, undeniable truth Jimmy had learned from reading Coffin's Bestiary of Fey and Deadly Creatures. While the book had been written in 1886 by Ezekiel Coffin, the information was pertinent, and it imparted one important truth to Jimmy. "I don't need to know what the creatures are," Jimmy thought, reflecting on the book and opening the jar of nails. He had shaken out several onto the workbench and put them in his pocket before he closed the jar and replaced it. "Iron should work, and if it doesn't, then I will be forced to try and find something else." He left the basement and struggled to return to his room. By the time he reached it, he had already been sweating and feeling tired, but the memory of Carlton and Dave's screams echoed through him. Jimmy dressed. Then he took down his spare belt and was pleased to see the nails fit snugly in the holes punched in the leather. It wasn't a sturdy weapon, but he hoped he wouldn't have to do anything more than strike 1 or 2 of the creatures to drive them away from his classmates. When he was on the first floor again, Jimmy gripped the belt by its buckle and wrapped the excess leather around his hand several times. He sneezed in his elbow and rubbed his eyes tiredly. The urge to go back up to bed was strong, but he shook it off, struggling to the door and letting himself out. He shivered at the cool air as it struck his face, and he made certain the door was unlocked before he closed it. Without another thought about the comfort of his room, Jimmy walked down the porch steps and into the backyard. He focused on where he had seen the creatures, and when he reached the place, he looked down at the ground. His eyes catalogued and recorded everything. He saw broken branches and drag marks on the ground. Small strands of burlap clung to the bark of several trees, and when he kept all this in the forefront of his thoughts, he could follow the trail. Turning to the left, he glanced up, seeking any sort of discoloration among the trees, any sign that the creatures might be watching him, waiting for him. There was nothing. Holding on to his makeshift flail, Jimmy followed the trail. It led him through the narrow tract of woods that separated the houses. Nothing, it seemed, could stop the creatures. There were bits of burlap that clung to deadfall, and there were signs that the boys had been dragged over large rocks. Jimmy was unsure as to how long he had been walking, only that the woods had become wider. No longer could he see houses on either side. The sounds of birds and squirrels were louder, and there was a deeper sense of solitude. He continued forward, and within another 100 feet, he heard crying. Jimmy slowed down and moved cautiously, creeping from tree to tree and peering ahead, fully aware that he could come upon the creatures and the boys at any time. As he began to step out from behind a large elm tree, he froze. Less than 20 feet away, he saw the burlap sacks. Not the creatures, only the sacks. Jimmy retreated behind the tree. He sank down to a squat and glanced out again from the protection of some ferns. The boys wept and the birds sang. Jimmy counted and listened. He reached 412 before he saw movement. From the trees around the boys, the creatures moved. Jimmy knew he was unable to see them because the creatures were standing still, and their ability to hide was impressive. At one moment there had been nothing. In the next, they were stepping out from trees and several large rocks as though they had been part of them. Perhaps they were, Jimmy thought, and he listened as the creatures spoke.
"I thought you said someone was coming, Eamon,"
one barked at another.
"I heard him, Liam,"
Eamon snarled.
"Don't you think I didn't?"
One of the boys cried, and the third creature kicked the burlap sack the sound had issued from. The cry was silenced, replaced by a whimper.
"Didn't you hear something, Peter?"
Eamon asked. Peter, the one who had kicked the burlap sack, shrugged.
"I thought I did, Eamon. But that doesn't mean a thing. Not out here."
"Shut it,"
Eamon retorted.
"We've another hour to walk, longer with the way these two caterwauls."
Peter sniffed and looked around. His strange face frowned, and he seemed about ready to speak when Liam did.
"Mayhaps it would be best to eat them here,"
he suggested.
"We can't get a proper fire going out here, not now,"
Eamon muttered.
"Shh,"
Peter whispered.
"Do you smell it?"
The other two lifted their heads, nostrils flaring.
"What is it?"
Eamon asked.
"Is it a human?"
Liam asked.
"Doesn't smell quite right, does it, Eamon?"
Eamon shook his head.
"Pshaw,"
Peter grumbled.
"Smells fine. Nearby, too."
"They can smell humans. They smell me,"
Jimmy thought. He straightened up and stepped out from behind the fern. All three of the creatures looked at him, their faces showing their surprise.
"Hell's bells, would you look at that?" Liam said. "There really was one. I apologize, Peter. You were quite right."
"Of course I was right,"
Peter stated, but he sounded mollified.
"You, human, what's your name?"
Eamon barked. The other two creatures stepped away from Eamon, and the reason was clear to Jimmy. They were going to try and flank him. Memories of books on tactics and strategy flooded him, but he shut them down, focusing only on the situation in front of him. "My name is Jimmy, Eamon. It is a pleasure to meet you." The three creatures laughed.
"You're a bright one,"
Eamon chortled.
"Tell me, what are my friends' names?"
"Liam and Peter. Liam is on my left, Peter is on my right," Jimmy stated. He walked into the center of the path. His head was throbbing, and he knew they were faster and stronger than he was. He could only hope the iron would work.
"You are a devilishly smart boy,"
Liam said, and Jimmy fought to keep his eyes on Eamon. By doing so, he could see Liam and Peter as well.
"Maybe you should come and sit with us a bit," Peter added. "We were about to have a conversation with these other two lads."
"Are they your friends?"
Eamon asked.
"Is that why you've come out here with a belt in your hand?"
The three creatures laughed. "No," Jimmy answered. "They're not my friends. What are you?"
"Sprites,"
Eamon answered.
Goblins,
added Peter.
Perhaps fairies, Liam concluded.
Ah, Jimmy forced a smile.
So, they're not your friends, but you come armed with a belt,
Eamon inquired.
What have you done? Driven nails through it?
The three goblins laughed. Iron nails, Jimmy informed them. Liam and Peter stopped for a moment, eyeing him. Eamon spoke.
Now, why would you have nails driven through your belt? Won't your mother be terribly upset with you for such an act?
Not for iron nails, he stated. He didn't bother telling them the nails weren't driven through the leather. He saw Liam and Peter glance at Eamon, who made a motion for them to sit, and they did so. Eamon scratched his chin and then sat down between the two burlap sacks. Jimmy was certain he could hear Carlton and Dave breathing hard. The wind shifted, and the leaves and branches rustled.
You know,
Eamon stated after a minute,
I don't smell any fear on you. You don't smell quite right, and I know there's no fear. Why is that?
I am not afraid. The three creatures chuckled.
What do you do for fun, Jimmy?
Eamon asked. I read, Jimmy answered. He saw Liam and Peter move a fraction of an inch closer.
What do you read?
Eamon asked. Everything. Jimmy took a deep breath. I'm going to have to run. Eamon frowned.
Everything covers a lot. Have you read about folk like us?
Jimmy nodded.
Is that why you've got a belt with iron nails in it?
Yes. The three goblins laughed.
Well, I won't lie to you, Jimmy,
Eamon grinned.
We're not fans of iron. Not a bit.
I know, Jimmy stated.
But have you realized there are 3 of us, and only 1 of you?
Yes. Eamon laughed.
You're a boy, and we're goblins, full-grown and old and hungry still.
I know you dislike iron. I will hurt you.
But it won't kill us,
Liam countered.
Not unless you've an iron knife somewhere on your person.
I do not.
So,
Eamon yawned and scratched behind one ear.
You came out here with some iron nails to rescue some lads who aren't your friends?
Yes.
Why?
Peter asked. Because you are going to eat them, Jimmy stated. From the burlap sacks came fresh moans, but Eamon didn't bother to reprimand them. Instead, he grinned at Jimmy. The goblin's mouth was filled with yellow teeth.
Oh, you're right about that, Jimmy. We were trying to figure out the best way to split 2 3 ways. But now you're here, and we can each get 1. I have to admit, we'll have to pick lots. You're a little skinnier than we would normally take.
As he finished the statement, the other 2 creatures launched themselves at Jimmy, and Jimmy took a single step back. Neither of the goblins seemed to have expected such an act, and they slammed into one another. Jimmy brought the belt smashing down with an overhead swing, the nails slamming into the back of Peter's neck. The goblin let out a shriek that pierced Jimmy's head and sent waves of nausea crashing over him. As Jimmy jerked the belt back, one of the nails remained embedded in Peter's neck, and the goblin clawed at it, black ichor leaking from his wounds. The goblin collapsed to the ground and tried to crawl away, but he had only made it a few feet before he stopped. Liam turned to Jimmy, and Eamon was racing toward him when Jimmy lashed out with the belt once more. Liam tried to block the blow with his right arm and grab Jimmy with his left, but it didn't work. Jimmy moved slightly to his own left as the belt flashed over the upraised right arm of the goblin. One of the nails caught Liam's eye and tore it out of its socket. All fight fled from the goblin, and he brought both hands up to his injured face. He staggered away, and Jimmy shook the eye off the nail. 𝐸𝐴MON came to a stop just out of reach of the belt. He looked at the still form of Peter and glanced at the retreating Liam. A cold smile spread across 𝐸𝐴MON's face.
Well, you're a little stronger than I expected, Jimmy, 𝐸𝐴MON whispered. Tell me, what have you got in mind for me?
Nothing, Jimmy answered truthfully. 𝐸𝐴MON frowned.
What?
Nothing, Jimmy repeated. I only wanted to come and free Carlton and Dave. A frown passed over 𝐸𝐴MON's face. He glanced at Peter again.
He's probably dead.
Probably, Jimmy agreed without taking his eyes off 𝐸𝐴MON.
Lehman's not going to be pleased about losing an eye.
I would think not.
You're a strange human,
𝐸𝐴MON stated. Yes. 𝐸𝐴MON's eyes narrowed.
Are you human?
As far as I know. The goblin sniffed, then shrugged his shoulders.
Yes, you kinda smell like one. They're not your friends?
Jimmy shook his head. They usually pick on me.
Why didn't you let us eat them then?
𝐸𝐴MON demanded. No one deserves that. The goblin dropped to a squat and scratched behind both ears.
I don't suppose you'd let me keep just one?
No, I'm afraid not. 𝐸𝐴MON sighed.
I don't like this. I think I have to try and kill you now.
Why?
Because you'll tell everyone else you saw us. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to remain tucked away with you lot stomping around?
No, Jimmy admitted.
Well, it's harder than hell is what it is.
I will not tell anyone, Jimmy stated. 𝐸𝐴MON's eyes narrowed.
You're telling the truth?
Jimmy nodded.
What about the other two?
𝐸𝐴MON asked, jerking a thumb back toward the burlap sacks. They will not tell either.
How can you know that?
𝐸𝐴MON stood up as he asked the question. I will tell you where they live, Jimmy informed him. If they talk, then you can go and take them. Is that not how some of the nursery rhymes go? The goblins will get you if you don't watch out. 𝐸𝐴MON looked at him. Then he smiled.
Yes, you're right. You'll tell me where they live?
I should probably tell you next to them, so they know what is being said, Jimmy told him. This way, they will know to keep their mouths closed. Maybe they will learn to keep a secret. Peter groaned.
Oh, he's not dead,
𝐸𝐴MON exclaimed happily.
But he's got that damned bit of iron in him still.
Jimmy stepped over to the prostrate goblin, grasped the nail, and before Peter could speak, he pulled it out. The goblin let out a cry of pain and clapped a hand to the wound.
Stop complaining and get up,
𝐸𝐴MON ordered. The other goblin did so, shooting a fearful look at Jimmy.
Come on,
𝐸𝐴MON stated.
We need to free our dinner.
Peter didn't ask why. Instead, he followed 𝐸𝐴MON to the burlap sacks, as did Jimmy, who kept a tight grip on his belt. The two goblins untied the thick ropes that had been tied around the tops of the sacks. 𝐸𝐴MON squatted between the two and pulled the openings down to reveal the terrified faces of Carlton and Dave. Their eyes were wide, and their skin was pale.
So,
𝐸𝐴MON began,
you two have a reprieve, This one," he nodded toward Jimmy, "came and helped you out, even though you're right foul to him, from what I can gather."
The boys looked at Jimmy, then back at the goblin.
"He won't let us eat you. More's the pity. However, you need to keep your stupid gobs shut," Eamon ordered. "Am I understood?"
Dave and Carlton nodded frantically.
"There's only one way to be sure you stay quiet,"
Eamon continued. Softly, just loud enough for the boys to hear, Jimmy told the goblins where Carlton and Dave lived. Dave fainted. Eamon grinned.
"Yes, I know where you live. What's more, I can read street signs, numbers. I'll pay a visit and will bring you home for supper without you being rescued by the likes of young Jimmy here. Am I understood?"
Carlton whispered.
"Yes." "Good."
Eamon nodded to Peter, and the two of them upended the burlap sacks. In a moment, the goblins were gone, leaving Jimmy alone with Carlton and the still unconscious Dave.
"How?"
Carlton asked. "Because I read," Jimmy answered. "Because I am autistic, and I remember everything I read." Together, he and Carlton woke up Dave and dragged him to his feet. The three boys walked in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.